So we are recording. Please do make sure that you're happy for this session to be recorded. We're operating Zoom webinar, so none of the participants will be available or accessible or visible to anyone, but do let us know if you have any concerns about this. So just before we start, I'd like to let you know we have automatic captioning available. If you'd like to use this, if you click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitles. Please note the captions are automated, so they're 99% but not 100% accurate. So my name is Poonam Joshi. I'm the Director of the Funders Initiative for Civil Society, and I'd like to welcome you to this event that's been organised by 3 of Bond's working groups. Those are the groups on civic space, on conflict policy, and on sanctions and counter-terrorism. And this event marks the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks and also the adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 1373. The resolution, when it was passed in the immediate aftermath of the attacks, called upon the international community to redouble its efforts to prevent and suppress terrorist attacks. And despite not offering any clear definitions of terrorism, the resolution dramatically changed the regulatory landscape for international law and counter-terrorism, with serious implications for democracy, rule of law, civic freedoms, and civil society. 20 years on, the legacy of that response has included a proliferation of counter-terrorism and national security laws around the world. In the absence of internationally agreed and clear definitions of terrorism and violent extremism, states have given themselves license to use these laws and discourse to target anyone deemed to be a threat. We've seen a sprawling and unaccountable set of UN agencies and bodies grow that are setting norms on counter-terrorism and security globally, including on many issues that significantly impact civil society. We've also seen an increasing harnessing by those bodies and states of digital technologies to preempt and prevent terrorism and violent extremism. And finally, we've seen that the focus on counter-terrorism has eclipsed the UN's commitments to peace and security, human rights, rule of law, and development. And as we've seen through the tragedy unfolding in Afghanistan, a situation that I know so many of you are desperately trying to respond to right now, terrorism and violent extremism present an existential threat to peace and security, development, human rights, gender equality, and to civil society itself. However, the massive expansion of state security power and the military invention justified to respond to the 9/11 attacks has only had a limited effectiveness in countering terrorism and extremism and keeping people safe. Instead, perhaps its most potent legacy has been the license it's given states to abuse security powers in ways that erode democracy, rule of law, and give cover to authoritarianism. In practice, what that's meant for civil society has included criminalization of activists, protesters, and journalists under anti-terror laws. We've seen civil society groups impacted by restrictive foreign funding measures, by interception and surveillance of their communications, by travel bans, all measures introduced to disrupt the enabling conditions for terrorism and violent extremism. We've seen many civic actors smeared as threats to security, and we've seen the work of peace building and humanitarian groups co-opted and instrumentalized. Looking ahead, the bad news is that the security toolbox is very much alive, and it's being repurposed to deal with new threats, as we've seen with the epidemic of emergency laws passed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The good news is that despite limited resources, civil society is successfully pushing back. It's putting civic space and civil society on the agenda of the UN agencies and transnational bodies with a mandate on counterterrorism and security. And examples of this include unprecedented engagement of civil society with the 7th review of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. The strategy sets out the joint approach of all UN member states to countering terrorism and extremism globally, so a very critical plan. And with the Financial Action Task Force, the body that sets the global norms on countering terrorist financing and money laundering. And we'll come to what civil society is doing and managing on these efforts in the second panel. So just ending by sharing with you the format for this event. We are going to open with the keynote speech from Special Rapporteur, followed by 2 panels of 45 minutes each with a break in between. And the panels will consist of presentations from leading experts, and we hope that we'll have time for about 15-20 minutes of Q&A at the end. You won't be able to ask questions by using the hands up function, but please do submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. In terms of what we're focusing on during the sessions, the first one is going to focus on the impacts of counterterrorism and security frameworks on civic space, peace building, development, and humanitarian assistance, and also looking at emerging trends. The second session after the break is going to look at concrete examples of what kinds of interventions from civil society have worked, and the short and long-term strategies available to civil society. And across both panels, we're going to be looking at opportunities for collaboration and also what support civil society needs to respond to the threats we're going to be discussing. Just for your information, as time is limited and we have such a fantastic lineup of speakers, I won't be sharing biographies. These are available in the event info on the Bond website. I'm now delighted to invite Fionnuala Ní Olán, the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Fionnuala is going to be making the keynote speech. And Fionnuala, just before I hand over to you, I want to stress what a hugely important friend and ally Fionnuala has been to civil society, enabling and advocating for civil society participation in the processes that we've mentioned, but also for her groundbreaking analysis on the links between counterterrorism security frameworks and closing civic space. And through that work, she's placed this issue on the agenda of civil society, including many of us here today and the UN. Fionnuala, thank you very much for joining us at what I know is a very busy and difficult time. I know you very kindly have agreed to stay for most of the first panel, but then you'll be leaving us. But we really appreciate you joining. So over to you.
Thank you, Poonam. I'm really glad to be here among friends. I'm joining you today from Geneva, where those of you who are following the events in Afghanistan will know that we are struggling with the inadequacy of member state responses to the unfolding situation in Afghanistan. Many of us have had many sleepless nights as we've watched and tried to assist in the evacuation of those at highest risks. Of course, in a context where states have failed to function effectively, cooperatively, or even attempt to address the scale of the issues in any coherent or ethical way. So I think all of us are struggling in a way with the reality of that. And of course, in that context, this discussion of the next 20 years could not be more prescient, because in some ways it's both poignant but really hard-headed for us to look closely at the events of Afghanistan as really the birthplace of so many of the institutional structures and the normative frameworks that have driven counterterrorism, as well as defining and limiting civic space and impacting on civil society over the past 20 years. It is also a moment when we're starting to see counterterrorism 3.0 emerge in the ruins of Afghanistan. And I think all of us are deeply aware of the dangers that lie ahead as states reposition themselves to continue to do counterterrorism and security work in the context of the changing landscape. So let me start by just saying a couple of things around legacy and sort of what these frameworks, this sort of landscape looks like today. And so, as I've said, there have been counterterrorism regimes have existed before 9/11. I grew up in Belfast, so we had a long familiarity with counterterrorism pre-9/11, as did many other states. But there was a really Teutonic shift that happened in the ashes and the embers of 9/11. And those had two dimensions. The first of those was the construction of a global counterterrorism architecture after 9/11. And that happened in a number of quite distinct ways. And I do want to say some things about that landscape, because it's really relevant to the experience of civil society on the ground and national level experience. So the first piece of that transnational architecture started at the UN. It started at the Security Council with the establishment of a body called the Counter-Terrorism Committee, and below that, a fully functional implementing body called UNCTAD. And it's important to note that while often many of us have observed how ineffectual the Security Council is, and that has in some ways never been more evident than it was in the last week in terms of the situation on the ground in Afghanistan. Just below the counterterrorism, the Security Council, it's important to understand that the Counterterrorism Committee, created in the aftermath of 9/11, has been an extraordinarily effective but largely invisible body. It has shaped both the regulatory landscape of states' behavior over the past 20 years. It's been enormously important in shaping normative content, the rules of the game for counterterrorism. And it's been able, because it has this enforcement machinery, to go beyond mere words and phrases on human rights and on counterterrorism, mostly minus human rights, and implement those on the ground. The second framework that I think we have to pay attention to is what's happened on the General Assembly side of the House of the UN. And again, quite close after the 9/11 events, we saw the emergence of an architecture out of the General Assembly. That architecture is now called the Office of Counterterrorism. It was consolidated as a single office in 2017. And it's really important to know how big and how significant that office is. It consists of over 140 bodies. It has a huge footprint in the UN system. And it's also largely financed by two states, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Kingdom of Qatar. And so sometimes when we ask who pays for these things, we understand what the priorities of these things and these spaces are. And these are really important things to understand about this architecture, is that it is neither a neutral architecture in terms of the states who support it, and it's not a neutral architecture in terms of the imperatives that drive it from a state perspective. It's also really important to know that these architectures that emerged in the kind of biggest multilateral space after 9/11 were human rights free zones, deliberately so. In the immediate aftermath of 9/11, as these spaces were emerging and being constructed, states were saying very clearly, no, human rights doesn't happen here. What happens here is security, and human rights and civil society are not part of this space. And so we have always been at a structural disadvantage because the spaces were constructed without us and designed to exclude us. And as many of the civil society actors on the call know, New York is the place where if you're a civil society actor trying to deal and engage on security issues, this is not a comfortable or embracing terrain. There's no space for you and there's no welcome for you in many of these spaces. Let me say a couple of other things about the other spaces that have emerged in brief. In addition to this UN architecture, we also saw the emergence of regional counterterrorism architectures in Europe, in Latin America, through the Organization of African States. We saw regional architectures, regional offices, regional technical support and capacity building emerging in all of those spaces. In parallel, many states, however, despite this burgeoning architecture, didn't think they had enough. And what they were particularly concerned about was the fact that the multilateral system was kind of slowing them down, notwithstanding that that multilateral system was designed to exclude the things that generally slow them down on security, human rights, and civil society. And so what we saw emerging, mostly and particularly around in the immediate aftermath, but accelerating in the years after that, were what we call the new counterterrorism institutions. One of those is an old new institution, which is the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is the most important counterterrorism entity you've never heard of, in a way, for many civil society actors. Enormously important in terms of engaging states and in regulating state behavior. Traditionally, again, a place where civil society had very little access, although I have to acknowledge, as Poonam has done, the extraordinary work that's been done by coalitions of NGO actors to colonize and engage in that space. But other spaces, for example, the Global Counterterrorism Forum, which was established really as a shortcut for states to kind of get past the clutter of getting things done in the UN, these kind of self-selected clubs where membership is exclusive, where the goal is to produce norms quickly and expediently and fast track them into state practice. And again, these are human rights and civil society free spaces. And the result of that is the kind of construction of normative pathways across multilateral, regional, and new institutions that really, again, are human rights free and civil society free, because they're designed precisely to exclude or to minimize the engagement of those norms and those groups from those spaces. The final layer of this cake that I think we all need to be aware of is the public-private space, because public-private partnerships have been central to the new counterterrorism landscape post 9/11. These include entities like GIFCT, the Internet Regulatory Forum set up by major players like Facebook and others. We've seen it in organizations or entities like Tech Against Terrorism. And again, these are both regulatory spaces, but they're norm-producing spaces. Spaces, again, that are exclusive of civil society actors and are generally free of human rights constraints. So how do these spaces work? Well, a couple of just things to flag. I've said the motif of this talk might be human rights free or human rights light. Again, all of these spaces are designed and function largely without human rights actors. And when human rights actors like my office show up to these spaces are occasionally invited in, we're usually invited in late. And we're usually invited in at the point where when we make human rights or civil society claims on these organizations or entities, we look like a problem. We look like we're slowing things down. We look like we're not with the program because these organizations and entities are already, 10 miles down the road to get to where they want to. And they just like you to come in and tell them that they're all doing what they're supposed to be doing. And that by inviting you, you've sort of validated or given them some kind of vindication for their work. So we are often either excluded or brought in at points where we can have no meaningful influence on the outcomes. The second is that these spaces are really intended to exclude civil society. The vibrancy, the engagement, the knowledge of civil society has generally not been wanted in these spaces. And when civil society is invited in, they're often invited in similarly at latter points when the stew is cooked and where they're simply supposed to, in some sense, be decorational edges to tables rather than meaningfully at the table negotiating the content of the norms and the practices that affect civil society at national and grassroots level. The third impact of these spaces is that normative regulation in security and counterterrorism has shifted. I recall as a young lawyer being taught really that the thing that mattered the most was treaties. This is what regulated international actors. But one of the things we should all understand is that in the last 20 years, we've moved away from treaties because states have understood that they can outsource regulatory practices to these spaces that produce soft norms that are soft in theory, but hard in practice, that really do a runaround the norms of equality, human rights, political participation, and so many other fundamental elements that the Charter, with all its limitations, was designed to include. And at the heart of this entire system is the mother problem, as I like to call it. And the mother problem is that we do not have a globally agreed definition of terrorism. And so what that means is that states get to define on their own terms who is a terrorist, and nobody ever calls them out on their definition. And the result of that for civil society over the past 20 years has been catastrophic. And I know many of you on the panels today are going to really benchmark the impact of that on us. And so what I really want to underscore is that this isn't a 9/11 problem. 9/11 facilitated a set of power moves and new institutions for key security actors and certain governments. It was an enabling device. It was a facilitator. And it created a legitimate space for states to use counterterrorism as the shield to do so much of their nefarious work at national level. Using counterterrorism, security, radicalization, and extremist narratives to paint civil society, to exclude women human rights defenders, to exclude humanitarians, to prevent journalists from doing their work. And it's been extraordinarily successful because we have an enabling global environment that has allowed states to continue to do this work almost without restraint. And the modalities are multiple. And I think we've seen them in the expansion of criminal justice regulation, but increasingly we see it operating as both administrative work and also a kind of a plethora of practices by state that are increasingly hard to get at as a legal matter. So where are we now? Well, of course, we're at 20 years to 9/11. And for many of us, that ought to be a moment of pause and reflection, where we as civil society and other stakeholders ask, has any of this architecture and this normative content worked to make us safer and more secure? Those of us who work in the societies who are at the blunt edge of these practices know that they have neither made us safer nor more secure. What they have done is enabled increasing authoritarianism, shrinkage of civic space, the weakening and hollowing out of democracies, and the undermining of the rule of law. Because counterterrorism has an ambitious agenda, and that agenda has been unfolding over the past 20 years. That agenda we've also seen merge into and be conveniently able to use the COVID-19 pandemic to make security indispensable to fighting a global health pandemic. And so for me as Special Rapporteur, when I see counterterrorism and security experts telling us they have the solution to COVID through securitization, we all know what that means. We know that it means further securitization. And so let me close by just underscoring the importance of our moment. Counterterrorism 3.0 is now emerging in Afghanistan, out of Afghanistan. We saw it in the bomb attacks in the aftermath of the tragic suicide bombing in Kabul. We see it in the language of states gearing up for the new threats that they articulate around Afghanistan. And looking forward, we have a lot of work to do. We need to have an agenda for transformative change, and that's what I hope we're going to hear today.
Thank you very much, Fionnuala. Thank you for that sobering presentation, which really spells out what's at stake, why this is such an important and cross-cutting issue for civil society, and just the urgency and imperative to respond to this counterterrorism Mark II. So in this first panel, we're going to be focusing on the impact that the security architecture Fionnuala's described and the ways of working of those agencies and bodies, what impact that's had on civic space and civil society across the respective fields that the speakers work in. We've also asked them to highlight for us what are the trends, both positive and negative, to watch out for. We know there's a massive intersection, for example, with technology and an evolving, rapidly emerging field that counterterrorism agencies and bodies are trying to regulate, and not in ways that are going to protect civic space or human rights. And then finally, we're going to be discussing what changes are needed to keep open the enabling environment for civic space and civil society. Our four speakers are, firstly, Katerina Hadzi-Macheva-Evans, who is Executive Director of the European Centre for Not-for-Profit Law. ECNL is the only regional organisation in Europe focused entirely on law and policy that affects civil society. And Ketty's going to be speaking about the impacts of counterterrorism and security frameworks and bodies on civic space. Second speaker is Mark Batak, who's Programme Manager for Initiatives for International Dialogue, which is a peace building and advocacy institution based in Southeast Asia. And Mark is going to be speaking about the impacts of what we've heard so far on peace building regionally. Thirdly, we have Martin Cottingham, who's Director of External Relations and Advocacy at Islamic Relief Worldwide. As many of you know, Islamic Relief provides development, humanitarian assistance in 45 countries. And Martin will be speaking about the impact that countering terrorist financing measures have had on access to banking and flows of funding for humanitarian action. And our final speaker is Rafael Zanata, Director of Data Brazil. Rafael is both a lawyer and activist and one of the leading voices in the digital rights movement in Brazil. And he's going to be speaking about the intersection of national security and technology and implications for civic space, including recent developments in Brazil. So Ketty, I'm going to come to you first.
Thank you, Poonam. 6 weeks after the shock of 9/11, the global community, under the umbrella of the Financial Action Task Force, introduced new rules around counterterrorism financing. As part of those, they declared the civil society sector as particularly vulnerable from terrorism abuse. There were no representatives of the non-profit sector in the room when that decision was made and when rules were created to control non-profits. It unleashed a string of restrictions on the work and existence of civil society. More than 10 years later, a global report led by the FATF found out that this particularly vulnerable premise and narrative did not and do not stand ground. The risks that civil society will be abused by terrorists was found very low. As a result, the FATF changed the premise. It called for a more nuanced approach, assessing in each country the actual level of risk and responding proportionally to that risk for the sector. But 20 years later, despite the change in these recommendations, there is ample evidence that counterterrorism policies continue to be used by invoking this original premise. They attack individuals, movements, and civil society rather than adopting a risk-based approach. The use of the narrative continues not only on the national but international context. We saw that most recently at the UN level in negotiations around the global counterterrorism strategy, which failed to fully integrate meaningful protections for civil society. We'll hear more about this later from Anna. So what were the implications of this? The particularly vulnerable became the most powerful narrative that defined how the space for civic action will be shaped in the decades to come. It gave justification to restrictive legal measures, which did nothing to address the actual terrorist threat, but they limited freedoms. Through our tracker, but also the work of the Special Rapporteur, we have documented over 150 legal measures that affected the work of different groups. As Poonam said, restrictions under the counterterrorism justification included supervision of civil society with government's interference, requests for additional administrative documents adding burden and distracting organizations from the missions, criminalization and killing of protesters and activists who spoke against government policies, surveillance, limitations of how funding can be fundraised from local communities and foreign sources. The counterterrorism measures led to stigmatization of groups and legal impediments to different sectors, from disaster response, pandemic response, humanitarian, human rights, peace building, environment, and women. It also led to the phenomenon of bank de-risking, where banks started to reject clients from the non-profit sector, suspended transactions, and limited possibilities to raise funds or to deliver aid. Most worryingly, this narrative continues to be invoked and integrated in new measures under the counterterrorism pretext. Most recently, environmental groups advocating for measures to prevent climate change were called eco-terrorists. Security approaches were applied in response to the pandemic. Technology and biometrics are used and misused to deter activists rather than terrorists. New standards around use of technology by terrorism fails to recognize the need for human rights and civic space safeguards. And as a result of this, not only organizations and activists suffer. According to the World Bank, when non-profits lose services, starvation and disease increase. And we asked a humanitarian worker about the impact on the ground. Her response was, people die. This situation continues despite growing evidence that the restrictive legal and the risking measures are ineffective and undermine their own counterterrorism goals. One study using state-of-the-art statistical techniques and looking at most countries in the world from 2009 to 2016 found no evidence that legal restrictions on civil society make a country safer from terrorist threats. The authors of the study found instead that countries may preempt terrorist attacks more effectively if they create the trust of population living in their borders and when police and security forces do not kill, torture, or arrest individuals. But these 20 years also showed us that despite all the restrictions, civil society is resilient, and I would call this particularly powerful actor. As we will hear from colleagues today, civil society continued to push back against these restrictions it faced on both national and international level, working through coalitions. On the national level, when civil society was partner, it was able to engage and work with vulnerable communities to minimize threats. They support good governance measures which help organizations lower risk of abuse. They do own risk assessments of the sector that try to identify weaknesses and work collaboratively to try to overcome them. We also see amazing examples from civil society coming across country, across the globe, united and changing international norms, including the Financial Action Task Force once. And we are starting to see some examples where governments are realizing that working with the sector together can help identify that proportionate risk needed and then figure out the right measures to regulate it. So we do need to apply this consistently, even at times when the sector speaks against governments and disagrees with their policies. So what we have learned and what we need to apply in the future, we need to abandon the approaches where we are moving based on preemption of risk and creation of negative narratives. They have a long-lasting impact. Legal measures need to be based on actual evidence and actual trends. I would also like to echo what the Special Rapporteur said about the importance to reform architecture, both global, regional, and national, and to really, truly, meaningfully understand its purpose and create limitations that protect rights. And we need to recognize the power of cross-sector coalitions, make sure that civil society is an equal and meaningful partner that sits on the table. If we do this, only then we can tell a different story 20 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ketty. Before I hand over to Mark, I know we're going to have very rich presentations and probably quite limited space for Q&A at the end. So I'll call upon participants to please enter your questions. And we'll also ask the panelists to answer questions as we go along, because we want to make sure you have as much opportunity for dialogue. And also just to remind you that the Special Rapporteur will probably be leaving in the next sort of 20 minutes. If you have questions for Fionnuala, please enter them now. And so Mark, coming to you next.
First, thank you for the space. It is nice to see friends in the community of practice here again. Let me go through my presentation in 3 parts. The background on the Philippines, second, the link to regional trends and global norms on counterterrorism, and lastly, on recommendations. As a backgrounder, Southeast Asia and the Philippines have always been treated as the second frontier of the so-called jihad and terrorism. Hence, in 2002, the Operation Enduring Freedom was even extended in the region and specifically in the Philippines. There is thus literature discussing how the war on terror have not only cemented the influence of military generals in the Philippine civilian government, but have also contributed to all-out war policies in the country. But I wish to focus on the recent resurgence of counterterrorism because it reminds us of the difficult lessons we have not learned since 9/11 and the global war on terror. For over half a century, the Philippines have experienced substantial security issues within its domestic borders. Insurgencies, counterinsurgencies, terror attacks, even outright military occupation. But huge effort and immense resources were poured in to shift away from military approaches to peace processes, not only from the international community and the government, but most importantly from the civil society and affected communities themselves. Let me repeat this because it's often missed, and this is the center of my input. Huge effort and immense resources were and are being poured into peace processes by civil society and affected communities themselves. Even in cases where formal peace talks have been terminated, peace processes have been fostered by communities themselves through back channeling, monitoring of violence, community dialogues and reconciliation, campaign and advocacy. My organization, IAD, is one of the vibrant community of practice engaging and supporting peace processes in the country, finding and building solutions every step of the way. But in July 2019, the Philippines was even the first to adopt a national action plan on PCBE in Southeast Asia. To solicit the support of local civil society and peace-building actors, it was touted as a positive shift away from kinetic approach towards more preventative approach. Yet just a year after and in the middle of the pandemic, the government passed the highly contested and draconian Anti-Terrorism Act. In our research published this June, which we did with Safer World and the Security Policy Alternatives, we found that the new Anti-Terrorism Act has enabled the government and the military to harass and suppress individuals engaging the peace process and those perceived to be the popular base of the communist armed movement, namely the progressive and leftists, the youth and students in universities, and indigenous peoples. Take note that these are usually sectors mentioned in national action plans and VE frameworks as vulnerable sectors. For the generals, framing the CPP and PA as terrorists was a convenient way to mobilize the state's legal and financial resources to run after who they perceive to be sectors supportive or at least sympathetic to the communists. One indigenous youth organizer we work with, among many, have told us in our research that he was told often by government officials that perhaps he is a rebel because he knows how to speak up. He said that when you talk about human rights, you are tagged as a terrorist. He has been included in supposed terrorist list and summoned by the military in across 3 different administrations. And the most recent one was just a week or so after the passage of the Anti-Terrorism Act. This hard approach of the government not only impedes on our ability as peace builders and human rights defenders to bridge divides and raise alarms when atrocities occur, but it puts our lives and limbs at risk, especially the communities that we work with. On the second part is the case of the Philippines is just one example of the downstream harms of counterterrorism norms at the global level. States will seize on the malleability of definitions in a UN strategy of what constitutes terrorism or violent extremism as justification to change domestic legislation and national counterterrorism practice. Authorities would cover a label of wide spectrum of behaviors, ideologies, political beliefs as evidence of an individual or group's extremism or links to terrorism. In the Philippines, just 2 days ago, the National Security Council has justified the government's anti-terrorism initiatives as being grounded in the global counterterrorism strategy, presenting the programs of the government with the pillars of the global counterterrorism strategy. In Indonesia, West Papua's students and youth activists have also been recent targets of terrorist labeling following the declaration of the West Papuan resistance movement as terrorists. In Hong Kong, the national security law has conflated terrorism, secession, and subversion. In Cambodia, environmental activists and critics of the pandemic response have also been labeled terrorists. In conclusion, in the last part, we offer 3 key recommendations. The first one is whether in the UN GCPS or in civil society spaces, we have to sustain honest discussions and reckoning on the rights abuses and escalation of conflicts in the wake of militarized and extrajudicial counterterrorism efforts. Second, we need to ensure capacity building and strategic security support for states do not reinforce abuse, corruption, exclusion, and conflict drivers. And finally, the UN and the international community must ensure that no counterterrorism or PCVE work carried out in the UN's name falls foul of human rights commitment and causes further discrimination and oppression, especially of minorities, and inadvertently feeds conflict. Most importantly, the UN, the international community, the aid system must prioritize and invest in peace building and conflict transformation strategies, and especially locally led organizations and solutions. We have to shift now the paradigm because people think, that the old paradigm is that the solution will come from the top. But we've seen as well how the security is defined. When it's defined from the top, it causes harms to those who are on the ground. We assert that the solution comes from the bottom. Terror-related violence and state violence are both serious problems. We in the local civil society and local communities are not only at the receiving end of violence, but please do not forget that we are also at the forefront of finding solutions. Please do not undo our work. Please support us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That's very powerful. And I hope in the second panel, we're going to be talking not just about what we can do to disrupt and reform, but alternatives. And I hope you join the Q&A for that discussion as well. I know Fanula is leaving shortly. I don't know if she is still on camera, but Fanula, I'm going to put a question to you that's come up because I think it's such a fundamental question. I know many people would be interested in your answer on this. And Martin, I will come to you in a moment. So the question, which is from James Savage at the Fund for Global Human Rights, was if a core problem is lack of definition of terrorism and violent extremism, are there proposals and advocacy efforts to give definitions and close this gap? And if so, what is the status of these and what support do they need?
Sure, no, it's a really, really good question. So actually, I say this as the special rapporteur, we do actually have definitions of terrorism. We have sectoral treaties, we have over 19 of them. And we also have a Security Council Resolution 1566, which the Security Council and its 5 permanent members agreed a core definition of terrorism. And we have a definition that's been a model definition of terrorism that's been put forward by the mandate I hold, which we consistently go to states to and say, this is a precise, narrow definition of terrorism consistent with your legal obligations under all of these terrorism treaties and your human rights treaties. The problem we have is not our inability to use those definitions, but the permissive environment we've created for states, which allows them to move outside of that, as well as the real, I mean, in some ways, this permissive environment is what states are seeking to defend. Because it's not an impossible, we have structural definitions. We also have choices by states that they work entirely outside of them. And most of my correspondence with states, and we correspond regularly with states on their national definitions of terrorism, it's just a core piece of the work I do, is we consistently point out to them that their definitions are inconsistent with their legal obligations under both terrorism treaties and human rights treaties. But it's really me and whose army, right? Because at the end of the day, unless we have oversight mechanisms that hold states to account in the same way that we hold states to account in other areas for their failures to regulate appropriately, we really are struggling with this permissive environment. And that's the place where I think our greatest work has to be done, stating clearly that this is unacceptable, and more clearly than that, holding states more firmly to the cost, because they really, and this is maybe to close on, this isn't a retail problem. This is a wholesale problem. Our friends, and I include here our like-minded countries, our European friends, our American friends, this isn't a problem of states over there. This is a problem of the states who say they defend civic space and human rights in their foreign policies. So the place where I think we could meaningfully start is actually focusing on those states who continue to exploit this permissive space, despite the many, many legal and political tools there are for them to operate within the law.
Thank you, Fionnuala. And I think when we come to the second part of the panel, as you said, there's very good work that's taking place around specific processes and bodies. And the question is, how is civil society supported to actually advance a much more radical reform agenda that speaks to the whole architecture and ways of working in a way that's effective and heard?
I mean, can I just add a footnote before I go? I'll take the privilege of leaving you to say, one of the key problems here is the lack of support for the civil society organizations doing this work. We have these scrappy, amazing coalitions, and there are a whole bunch of them going to be talking today, who all of this work that they're doing on securitization is often outside of the core funding they have, because for a very long time, this issue hasn't been a priority. It's sort of too hard. It's not sexy. It looks like you're on the wrong side because you're arguing against states' definitions of terrorism without failing to understand the kind of umbrella of nefarious state work that are being done under securitized umbrellas. And so I think the key thing here, we've seen extraordinary work being done in the FATF space, in the UN space, at regional space, and at national space. And I'm looking at Mark in particular, but others too, who've done this extraordinary work in naming and benchmarking and holding states. But this is like an ad hoc train that's being held together by goodwill and an enormous amount of effort that is not funded. So a special rapporteur who's part-time and unpaid, I think I can say that.
Absolutely, Fionnuala. And I think maybe in the second half, I know a number of us are involved in setting up a new fund and attracting new resources to this work, and there are some funders on this call, but this work isn't going to take place without resource. You're absolutely right. So thank you for that point. On that point, I will then move on to Martin. Martin, I think you're on mute. Are you having any problems coming off mute? Let's just see. I'll just ask one of my colleagues at Bond to see if they can help. Ketty, you said that there's a question on CTED. If you could answer that. I think we're just going to blend the Q&A into the panel. So Ketty, please go ahead and answer that question. And Martin, actually, Martin's unmuted, so I'm going to come back to him. Thanks for that, Ketty. Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Poonam. So as you've said, Islamic Relief Worldwide is an international aid and development organization. We operate in over 40 countries. We're a Muslim faith-based organization, so we are inspired by Islam and its teachings, but we're also a humanitarian organization, which means that we fulfill humanitarian objectives, humanitarian values, which means that we seek to help people of all faiths and none without discrimination. We're established in 1984 in response to the famine in the Horn of Africa, and we now have programs focused particularly in the Middle East, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And in implementing those aid and development programs, we find ourselves working in some of the most difficult and dangerous situations in terms of fragile states, conflict zones, places like Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan. And issues of financial access are very much to the fore. And the phenomenon you've already had described to you of bank de-risking is something that we've experienced significantly and we have to deal with some success, but with a lot of drain on our resources and a lot of challenge. I think it's important to say that we at Islamic Relief do believe that it is important to have strong counter-terrorism measures and to have decent due diligence if you're a humanitarian organization. And we feel that not least because we ourselves have been the victims of indiscriminate violence in our programs. And it's interesting to hear reference made to the failure really to define terrorism. Over the years, we have lost 8 of our humanitarian workers to bombs and bullets in places like Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Kenya. I think 6 of the 8 were down to non-state actors, designated terrorist organizations by another name, but 2 of them were as a result of action by state forces, military action by state forces. So we've lost people ourselves to indiscriminate violence, and we are doubly determined because of that to make sure that the generously given support from the public really reaches its intended recipients. But what we're finding is that some governments and financial institutions have misinterpreted the measures that have come out of the counter-terrorism finance architecture that we've been hearing about. We ourselves work closely with banks. We abide by the counter-terrorism financing measures since 9/11. We are privileged to have a very good relationship with our main bank, who take a very close interest in everything we do, which isn't meant to sound like a negative. It's a really close partnership. But some governments and financial institutions don't take the time to deal with organizations in detail. They take, in some cases, a sweeping risk-based approach. Their risk appetite in many cases has changed, and some banks are now reluctant to deal with whole swathes of organizations which they have decided are high risk, and they might face big regulatory fines for engaging with the wrong people in the wrong places. And they choose to deal with that by just casting those organizations aside and denying them banking services. And this particularly affects some places that particularly need aid and are therefore places where people can least afford to do without the infrastructure of transferring international aid to support them locally. So there are unintended consequences to rules that exist for good reasons, and they include significant delays to the delivery of aid, in some cases complete blocks on the delivery of aid for some transfers and some locations. And some sections of civil society are disproportionately affected by this. So smaller local organizations many of whom don't have the resources of an organization like Islamic Relief to go through the detailed due diligence that's needed to understand the regulations, to engage with the whole architecture that we've been hearing about. Muslim faith-based organizations, some have faced a discriminatory approach which brands them in themselves as a risk because of their faith base and because of perceptions about where the roots of terror primarily lie. Organizations linked to global diaspora who are raising funds for affected populations in particular parts of the world, that they're also struggling with all of this. All of these organizations are crucial humanitarian players, some of whom have trust, have connections on the ground in local communities that some Western-based international NGOs simply don't have. But these organizations are finding it harder to transfer funds and to deliver aid in a timely way. Just a couple of examples of how this has affected Islamic Relief. In 2020, we tracked £93 million worth of international transfers. This would be going from our international HQ in the UK primarily to various countries around the world. We found that 40% of that £93 million was queried by banks in some shape or form, leading to delays. And 4% of those transfers were completely rejected. We weren't able to get the aid to where we wanted to get it to. Typically, these delays that I've described of the 40% pertained to about a period of about 3 to 12 weeks. And I'm sure you'll appreciate in an emergency situation, that can cost lives, that kind of delay in getting aid through. And the number of people we've calculated that were affected by these delays in 2020 alone was over 3.7 million. And we are an organization that is trusted by Western governments to deliver aid. Half a dozen of them fund us. We're trusted by UN bodies. We're one of the main implementing partners of the World Food Programme in Yemen. So we're an organization with a good reputation for delivering aid in some of the most difficult and dangerous places, but still so much questioning is going on of our work, so much scrutiny that is disproportionate to the work that we're doing. We've been audited over 500 times in a decade. Not one of those audits has found a shred of evidence of any inappropriate links to terrorism or extremism or of diversion of funds. Imagine though how much harder it is for an organization that's smaller, that's local or regional rather than global, to deal with all of these challenges that we're dealing with. We had a recent example where we wanted to repair 15 boreholes in Somalia during dry season, during a period of drought, a much needed humanitarian intervention. The money got there eventually, but it was held up in the banking system for 6 whole months before these boreholes could be paid for. The work had got underway, but you need the money to go through to pay for the work. Just a final couple of examples. Currency transactions are we estimate that around £500,000 was the additional cost that Islamic Relief had to pay in currency through not being able to conversion because of the restrictions that we face. We also estimate that in that same year, 2020, we spent around £300 funds that could have been going to those that need it most on the whole challenge of compliance and financial access and de-risking. So what now needs to happen? Fundamentally, we think that banks and governments and NGOs all need to work more closely together and more seriously on this. We would say that banks aren't the enemy here. They're sometimes characterized as that. I think there are things that banks, that governments, that NGOs all need to do to move things forward. What I would say about the banks is that along with the NGOs a lot of the time, we are trying to navigate our way through a fog of uncertainty. And we need help from the regulators and from governments to make clear not only what these regulations apply to, but equally importantly, what they don't apply to, so that we can do our jobs without looking over our shoulders inappropriately all the time. What I think banks need to do is stop adopting this blanket de-risking approach, which some of them do. It's by no means all of them. Engage with individual organizations, individual situations and conflict zones on their merits. Do your due diligence, take your responsibility to the people that need support in conflict, in extremis, seriously. In the case of governments, don't wash your hands of what the banks are doing as the commercial decision of the banks. Required. And in the case of NGOs, we really need to up the ante. We've been hearing, and it's good to hear this from Fenella about how we are working to counter these challenges, but we need to do more, because as I've described, the problem is significant. And it's really only by working together, banks, governments and NGOs, that we can make progress on this. So we're not talking about this being an even bigger problem in 20 years' time.
Thank you, Martin. I have to say, even though I was aware of the challenges Islamic Relief has faced, it's very shocking to hear the scale of what you've had to deal with. I'm going to finally turn to Raphael. I'm very conscious that we're almost at break time. Raphael, I want to give you your full opportunity to speak, but what we then will do is, after you've spoken, I think move to a break, give participants an opportunity to stretch their legs. What I will alert the panelists to is that there are a number of questions in the Q&A for Mark and Ketty. I know you'd offered to answer the question to Fenella, so I'd encourage you to answer them in writing if you have an opportunity, and if not, we'll come to them at the end of panel 2. So Raphael, over to you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting this conversation with extremely important topic, and congratulations to Bond and Poonam for arranging this conversation, which is really intense. I'm learning a lot, really, with you guys. I will reinforce some of the remarks I delivered at OECD's Civic Observatory meeting, because they contextualize the discussion from a Latin American perspective, which I think is important as an input from my side. So the first point, which is extremely important for the future of counterterrorism and from our background, is that in Latin America, the concept of terrorism as mobilizing regional norms and practices has a really strong connection with our dictatorial past. So terrorists were the subservient citizens. They were the citizens of the left. There were no outside enemy, but inside enemies. So enemies from within. There has been vast literature about this from Thomas Skidmore, Maria Helena Alves, and other scholars that wrote about how Brazilians, they took advantage of an international movement of terrorism, but they reframed in legal terms norms about terrorism to fight internal enemies. If you look to the recently announced strategic plan for intelligence and national security that was published 2 weeks ago in Brazil, it is happening as well. The strategy talks about using new technologies to identify preemptively potential threats to the national security. And the plan says that there are a series of threats that could be announced or in preparation that can be identified with the use of technology and technological intelligence tools to promote the prevention of violations of public order. So they use this very broad concept of public order and destabilization of institutions. Second issue is that the pandemic brought about a new set of problems, for sure, about the surveillance technologies and the increase of data collection in order to allow more COVID control mechanisms. But we did have some important victories that can be used in the coming decade. For instance, there has been a tremendous work from the ground in setting up data protection legislation and also declaring data protection as an autonomous fundamental right. This occurred by the Supreme Court in Brazil last year with the work of many organizations such as ours. And the court decided that there are no exception spaces. Even in the pandemic does not legitimize violations of fundamental rights. There was a clear message that data protection was part of the vaccine for COVID. This is extremely important. This week, the Brazilian Congress approved a constitutional amendment stating that personal data protection is a fundamental right. This is an important move because if we can frame intelligence activities and national security activities in a democratic perspective, having a connection with data protection as a fundamental right, this means that those activities cannot occur in a space of exception. They must be bounded by the grammar of fundamental rights. This victory is an important one, but can be also small compared to other threats that we are seeing. So we have been witnessing in Brazil cases of indigenous leaders being harassed by the federal police for their online demonstration against the federal government. Brazil has more than 300 ethnic groups, indigenous groups, working and fighting for their rights, and they are constantly monitored and harassed by the government. There has been creation of digital dossiers on anti-fascist public servants, for instance, and now the government is also trying to deploy new open source intelligence softwares within the Ministry of Justice to monitor political opponents or people that they believe that they must follow constantly. So what we saw with the Forbidden Stories initiative, with the increase of public procurement of spyware softwares, it will certainly happen in Latin America. So we need to reinforce quickly alternatives at the international level, such as moratoriums, a global ban on informational weapons that are intrinsically illegal, such as Pegasus. And we need to work together globally to try to prevent this from happening and using the grammar of fundamental rights. Today, there was a small victory as well in Brazil. We overturned the National Security Act of 1983, still from the dictatorial past, but still this new legislation creates some new types of crimes, such as crimes against the function of institutions and the crime of espionage, which might affect as well the sharing of information from civil society. I also must say that there is a concerning trend regarding the connection between terrorism and cybersecurity issues. We have been witnessing in Brazil and Latin America a growing militarization of this field. So an attempt to conceptualize the attacks on critical infrastructure as terrorist issues in legal terms. And in Brazil especially, the military has dominated much of this debate on cybersecurity. So this could be a trend in shifting the meaning of even what personal data protection mean or digital rights in the future, which should be about people, freedoms, abusive discrimination, and not about sovereignty and only national security. So this is a big fight for the future, as Fionnuala said. We must not allow like a human rights free zone in this discussion or a fundamental rights free zone. A third really concerning trend is the attempt to include financial crimes and ransomware attacks as terrorist activities. So there has been a considerable amount of pressure from big banks and also some new counter-terrorism institutions, as Fionnuala said, to redefine criminal law and financial scams and device hacking. This is huge, of course. We had an increase of 23% of ransomware attacks in Brazil this year, in 2021. This represents 481 million attempts of attack. This is like 1,400 blockings per minute. In Ecuador, there was an increase of 75%, in Peru of 71%, with more than 2,000 attacks per minute. So of course, this is happening. There's a strong lobby by the financial sector to speed up, like the Budapest Convention, to formulate new criminal law regarding ransomware attacks. And this has led to an extremely worrisome scenario of an increased criminalization of these conducts. This could represent risks as well for journalism, for data activism, for other types of civil society work that use devices, that has some kind of a double checking of vulnerabilities of devices by the government or so on, that could be considered as device intrusion or even terrorist attacks and this expansion of the legal terms. So we need to be very cautious about the expansion of this concept in both local and international arena. Finally, to conclude, because I apologize for using this last minute, we need to include attack firms in the conversation when we're talking about extreme violence in the online environment and terrorism. This is occurring strongly in countries like Colombia. So Colombia has been trying to label the work of civil society as inciting violence. So the government is pressuring like Facebook, Google, Instagram, tech firms to enforce human rights standards to remove this content using the logic of human rights. So it's a subversion of the logic itself. And intermediaries have been pressured and they cannot give in. So we must also call them to the conversation and be part of the conversation and understand how they're being pressured and how we can have strong concepts and approaches. So they must not give in countries such as Brazil, Colombia, and other authoritarian governments. So we need also to broaden up the scope of the conversation and not forget about the role of the tech firms in the next decade when we're talking about these issues. So I thank you so much for the conversation, and I'll be here with you guys.
Thank you very much, Raphael. And I know in the second panel where we're going to be looking at the global counterterrorism strategy, you highlighted two of the areas there of concern, that heightened focus around technology and regulating it, but to support the logic of counterterrorism and security, not rights, but also this broadening of what's being brought under the rubric of being defined as a terrorist threat, and what's termed as violence. And I hope we'll get to discuss a bit of that in the second panel. We are running way over time. I want to give an opportunity for the panelists to answer a couple of the questions that came up. Please keep your answers very, very brief. And if you'd like to expand, if you put them in writing, I want to make sure that everyone gets a 5-minute break. So the first question, Mark, I'm coming to you, was from Callum McLean. And it was, the fuller question is in the Q&A, but it was around how we can advocate against the risk of further heavy-handed militaristic counterterrorism efforts and protect programming in already fragile societies. And the second question, Ketty, I'm going to bring to you, that was for Fanula, around what kind of strategies CSOs can develop to engage with CTC and CTED going forward. So Mark, first to you.
Thank you for the question. I think as someone working on a sub-regional and local level, what we see is a huge problem is justification for counterterrorism and how the approaches is geared and founded on assertions that this is needed to solve the problem, that this is for security. And I think we need to challenge that core argument. And in fact, there are many cases where hard approaches, especially those imposed from outside without local leadership, without context sensitivity, do more harm than good. So I think the most immediate thing that we could do that is within our control is really to document surface stories where I think the next panel will cover that, where there are alternatives, there are solutions that are not hard, and that we're in human security and human rights at the center of the responses. Local actors at the center of those initiatives, to counterpose that to the assertion that this hard approaches are necessary, because I think there are a lot of cases where there is. Often they are erased because, again, the discussion of militarism, security is often thought to be, there's a certain kind of expertise. Local actors are not perceived to be expertise. Finula already mentioned that, for example, my organization, even my presence now, it's beyond programmed resources that we have. Our engagement on counterterrorism is not within what we are supposed to be doing. But we decided to go into this work because it has been affected, the peace building work that we do, and we need the support of partners, civil society, who are closer to spaces where discourse, knowledge is being formed, policies are being formed to surface that story. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And Ketty, to you.
Yes, very briefly, the question was what we can do and do we need more nimble strategies to work with the counterterrorism committee and CIRET. And I think here I just want to point out that we have the same situation we had with FATF about 9 years ago, which was we don't really know what they do and how they do their work because it's very much untransparent and closed. So what we need is to really first try to investigate and understand all the ways in which they work and impact the civil society and human rights. Then use that evidence to speak to them about their negative impact and harm, and then use examples that we have applied to different circumstances and similar to their work to show how it can be done better. So specifically, the CTAD mandate is changing this year through a resolution. Their reports, they do similar country level assessments as the Financial Action Task Force, which are not public. So we need to be asking for those to be public. We need to be asking for states to make them public. We then need to, from the ones that are made public, find the evidence of how they actually use and misuse the information in order to be able to apply their regulations. CIRET has been quite open actually to do that, and they have started to work with us to open up and invite civil society to dialogue with them. So we need to continue doing this. And similarly to what Leah will speak about doing with the FATF, we have offered to them to train them or to provide them with the knowledge and information they need to do their job better. So I think if we apply these 3 very concrete, specific, targeted steps, we might be perhaps moving some ground in this area.
Thank you, Ketty. That's excellent